So hi everyone, welcome to Atlas's Town Hall on how to counter transnational repression. I'm Colombe, I'm one of the co-founders of Atlas, and I have with me Nik Williams from the Index on Censorship that will talk to us about what transnational repression is. It's a complicated term, but it probably impacts your life in some way or another, whether you know it or not. And what we can do to support people that are victims to it, and what our government should be doing in the first place. And we're having this discussion for many, many reasons. One of them is it's an issue, as we'll hear, that has been increasing across the world. So one that we should be discussing more. Our team in India actually has asked us to host it in the first place. Because in India, the Modi government has been cracking down on the press at home, but then they also host the Tibetan government in exile, which is the Tibetan government in exile, as the sentence says, that has been where members of the Tibetan government in exile and journalists covering it have been increasingly subject to transnational repression. So for the Indian team, it was very much important to address this. They are getting ready to potentially run for elections in the near future in Delhi, in student elections and in state elections. And they wanted to start having a policy on transnational repression to bring forward, and in general on the freedom of the press. And as we've talked with our members across the world, it's a request that has come up over and over again. So we thought we'd invite Nik here, who is an expert on the topic. So welcome, Nik. Thanks so much for joining us bright and early in Glasgow.
Thanks so much, and it's really great to hear that there's interest in this, and also looking at it on a granular nation by nation level as well. But as you mentioned, your members in India looking at it as part of the extension of the clampdown in India, which has hastened over the last few years, especially as Modi, the BJP power has sort of been cemented. And then the question should be is when does that power start looking outward to the diaspora, exile movement? Obviously there's a big Indian community in the UK. My mother's Indian, so we're part of that. And there's always that question as when does that repression that you see manifest domestically start looking outwards to diaspora movements, people in exile, or just critics as well? Because you see different tactics across different countries and different areas of focus and different countries of focus as well. So I don't know whether I should just go into it.
I was actually going to ask you first to define for us what transnational repression is. Because I think the freedom of the media is something that most people understand. To what extent it actually is a thing in most countries is up for debate. But I think transnational repression is a very complicated term that very few people are aware of.
Yes, I mean, it is a term. It's a term that people will may be aware of, but just may not know this term connects to it. So basically, the way I sort of think about it, it's the externalization of repression aimed at critics of any regime. You see it with very established authoritarian regimes such as Iran and China, but you're also seeing it with slightly softer authoritarian regimes. Some countries in the Caucasus, Central Asia, as well as countries such as like Turkey, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia. So it's looking at how dissidents who may be living in exile or have sought refuge or have migrated for other reasons outside of political repression, how with them speaking up, with them realizing their right to free expression or continuing their campaign work, how they themselves are then targeted beyond the national border of that state itself. This is not new. There's always been this attempt by authoritarian regimes to target dissidents. We've always heard the stories of critics of the USSR dying on the streets of London, and that's also not consigned to the past. That's happened very recently in the UK. But because of how high risk it was and how high cost it was tended only to be seen for the most high value of targets because of the jeopardy of being caught and the geopolitical issues that would have been brought to bear if it was found that a state had instructed for the assassination or rendition of a dissident in another country, potentially an ally. So it was only used for the very high value targets. However, unfortunately, now the tools of repression, most of them are online, have sort of fallen in cost, and they're far more far more accessible, far more obtainable by states that have no requirement for any human rights oversight, any requirement of rule of law or international judiciary or an oversight process. So as these tools have plummeted in price and have become more accessible for authoritarian regimes, and as more dissidents have been forced into exile, we are now seeing a world almost custom built for transnational repression. So irrespective of where you go, you can still be threatened by the state that you fled from. At Index, we've done a lot of work, with dissidents in exile. Also, over the years, we have tried to support and get people out of countries if their work is inviting too much danger for them. And there's always that great relief when you've got them over the state line, when you've got them into a safe third country. Unfortunately, transnational repression undermines that sense of relief, because even when they are out of the country, they're still potentially targets of surveillance, hacking, trolling campaigns. Also, and then it can obviously get more severe. You can look at things like sort of assassination attempts, rendition, disappearance, imprisonment. So this is we need to see it as part of the toolkit of authoritarian regimes. No longer will repression stop at the border. We will see it externalized and really challenge concepts of sovereignty, and also place the responsibility for protecting dissidents not just on the state where the target originates, but also the host country that is currently putting them up, and obviously they then have a responsibility to protect that dissent. The term itself was coined by Dana Moss, a sociologist in the US, but as we're seeing it more and more be sort of embedded in how we look at repression and overseas repression, I think it's a very important term. There's also the growing aspect of the digital aspect, which Citizen Lab and other platforms have defined it as digital transnational repression, which is not separate to transnational repression. It just highlights one of the tools that facilitates such repression. And that is an increasingly important story. And we will see we'll all be aware of how it manifests. So things like Pegasus or Predator. So commercial spyware is a really powerful tool in the toolbox for digital transnational repression, both for capturing intel, sowing discord within overseas, just to be able to know what they're talking about, who they're speaking to, and to map the network of people of dissent. There's been in a study in a Freedom House investigation, for example, of the 31 states that they identified had committed acts like assault, rendition, and assassination between 2014 and 2020, 21 of those 31 states had used some form of digital threat, and at least 17 had relied on spyware. So this sort of shows how embedded into transnational repression tactics digital technologies are now. And the obvious reason is because it's incredibly hard to attribute. It's nearly impossible. That's the key part of transnational repression that hopefully we'll talk about today. But I hope that helped as a definition.
Yeah. So let me ask you a few questions on the definition, and then I'm actually super interested in learning more about the countries that use it the most, whether democracies are part of it, and so on. So if I recap, basically, let's say I'm a journalist, I flee an authoritarian country, I go abroad, and transnational repression would be the government from which I fled using, at worst, abduction, murder, or else, at best, threats, potential trying to censor me, and so on. How could it impact my family back home? Because I'm asking because, for example, one of the things I've talked with a lot of Tibetan journalists is that they stopped reporting, basically. They stopped talking about Tibet for a reason. It's not even the threats that they're receiving themselves, it's that they know that their families at home risk torture, imprisonment, or worse. And so they self-censored in a way to try to keep those they love at home safe. So do you see that happening a lot in other situations than Tibet, for example, or is that something that is very much, happening there and not a main tool of transnational repression?
You see it is a tactic. It's a tactic that you see China use, you see Hong Kong authorities use. We've also seen examples of it in Belarus as well. The targeting of family, parents, siblings, children, in a manner to sort of silence. A lot of states, and they may not want people to leave the country. They may not want people to flee. But if the idea goes that if you keep your nose out of politics, if you keep your mouth shut, if you just work somewhere else, and maybe send money back to your family, maybe if you're just sort of a migrant, like an economic migrant, but as soon as you start making connections with others, and you see a lot of the Uyghur diaspora as well in Europe, especially, Index has done some previous work on the sort of threat to the Uyghur diaspora in Europe. If you start organizing, or if you start speaking to your local representative, if you start trying to call for the release of Uyghurs, the sort of liberty for Xinjiang, if you start trying to play a role, people do receive messages. Either sometimes it will be through embassies or consulates or embassy staff, or it will be through more informal channels like comments made online, or phone calls saying, if you keep on this work, your sister still in Xinjiang, your brother in Hong Kong could be at risk. So I think this is definitely a vulnerable spot. So you do see a lot of people who will not speak out until their family can get out, if their family wants to get out. So that is always an incredibly vulnerable spot for people who still have connections. And you do get a lot of people who have no connections left to the country. So maybe their whole family have fled. Or they don't have, their family may have passed away. And you see that's the step when they start being active, is when they feel like they don't have that point of pressure anymore, and that they know that their work can't be used to attack people that they know and care for.
Okay, so let's name names. Who are the biggest powers using transnational repression? Who are the ones in terms of sheer numbers that use it the most, and where does it happen? Is it in Europe? Is it in the US? Like geography-wise, what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, numbers it's very hard to sort of. There's not enough sort of analysis on sort of that, I would say, that granular level. Again, Freedom House is doing some exceptional work, but I think countries where you see it very prominent are, I would say, Iran, China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, sorry, I just said that, Rwanda, Russia, and smaller countries who maybe do like what happened in Belarus, where the plane was literally, they've not been one of the more prominent countries on this study, but then doing something as brazen as that, and it shocked Europe, and rightfully so, the power it exerted over that private company to get that plane down, and then forcibly remove someone off that. He's just a journalist. That was it. That he knows nothing. It was a purely political persecution. So transnational repression really allied these sort of authoritarian states with strong democracies. So you'll see people moving from states like Iran, Rwanda, Russia, Saudi Arabia, to relatively strong democracies, countries where you can claim asylum, places where you can seek work and continue to work in exile. So you'll see a lot of people targeted at transnational repression in countries such as Canada, Scandinavian countries, the UK, the US, Australia. So you have this really uncomfortable collision between these different ways of approaching democracy and rule of law. But with that, and this will go to the conversation about policy remedies, is there's responsibilities on both those states. There's responsibilities on the states where the threat originates, and there's responsibilities on the states that are hosting the targets. Those responsibilities are of course different. It's not, Canada aren't to blame for threats from Iran, but they still have a responsibility to ensure the people in their country are protected and to know what the dangers they face are. And that's a really challenging thing.
Yeah.
That is just how you navigate those different spaces and how you approach it as well.
Okay, so we're going to move to solutions in just a second. And I see actually a question from Andrea about social media companies that I also wanted to ask. But first, there's a challenge that I got on social media, which I want to put to you, which is, that's not me speaking, by the way. I wouldn't speak this way, but all countries commit transnational repression to an extent or another. The United States harasses or kills people abroad. How is that different from what China does? And so my question then, based on some of those comments we've got lately, is at what moment of a democratic deterioration of a country does it become transnational repression? Can you have transnational repression from democracies to critiques abroad? For example, as you can hear from my accent, I'm French. I don't know if you saw a French investigative journalist in France, so it's not transnational, but got arrested and then released for theoretically looking into state secret. If she was abroad, would this have been transnational repression? Or does it only happen when it's more systematic and from authoritarian countries? And I'm asking because you mentioned India in your introduction. So at which moment would India's authoritarian tendencies and attempt to control the population abroad become transnational repression?
I think obviously the key factor in transnational repression is the ease by which and the nature of it crossing over territorial borders. That's really there's no stipulation that it must come from an authoritarian state. I think we tend to see it through an authoritarian state. And through index, our lens on this is looking at it when it attacks freedom of expression. So the direct use of these threats to silence dissidents who are speaking out, so whether it's journalists, playwrights, academics, scientists. So we tend, and I will say most of the threats you do see from authoritarian or weak authoritarian countries. This is not to say that every other country has their hands clean. And as you've remarked accurately, states like France, the US, established democracies have huge, and obviously, the deaths of journalists in Europe have come from relatively strong democracies, Malta, Netherlands, Northern Ireland, obviously within the UK. Greece, although Greece obviously has had a huge collapse in its press freedom protection systems and is now one of the weakest democracies in terms of press freedom in Europe. Obviously, this is not to give a sort of a carte blanche to crimes perpetuated by democracies internationally, but it's to look at that, our focus is to look at how these targets affect our fundamental freedom. So these are sort of political targets that we're looking at. So journalists, campaigners, dissidents, people like that. So I'm just saying, we tend to see the flow from authoritarian regimes countries. And authoritarian regimes where that has, I would say, relatively large communities in exile. And so when there needs to be that decision that seems to have been made that they need to start controlling the narrative outside its borders as well. It's not enough to control and censor the narrative within the state. They need to forcibly change that narrative outside as well. Okay,
I want to try to talk solutions. I received a few questions on this, and I want to talk about it through, if that's okay with you, three lenses. So we said it's transnational, right? So it's a global problem that happens across borders. So I'll just put the three and then we can dive into each one of the three. But can global organizations, for example, like the United Nations or anything else that's intergovernmental, do anything to end transnational repression? Theoretically, it should be within their radar mandates and everything else. The second aspect that I have for you is nation states, right? What can countries that host dissidents do to support them in the first place when they're victim of transnational repression, address it, but then also tackle transnational repression as a whole. And I'm asking this because, again, for example, with Tibet, we were told recently that one of the largest communities of Tibetans abroad is in France again, where they have been reporting countless acts of transnational repression and nothing has been done. There's been no answer from the state. And they were saying themselves, so I might give you one of the answers, that one of the very easy measures to implement is to have a hotline to get support, but that this is not being done. So what can states do? And the last element, which is linked to the question that we just got from Andrea, is social media companies. So you mentioned a lot of transnational repression happens online. What is the role of social media companies in addressing it? And I'm saying that because actually I came to one of Index's exhibition on transnational repression in London a couple of months ago. And I think you had the couple Lum Lee and Lum Long from Hong Kong that was there. And we've done exhibitions with them in the past as well. And they were telling us that their social media accounts keep on getting erased. So their Instagram page, Facebook pages, and so on. So obviously they get harassed abroad, but also their livelihood is threatened because social media companies just kind of kill their accounts over and over again. So what is the role of social media companies? Again, it's a lot, so let's take it from the beginning. It was just to kind of set the stage because I'm receiving a lot of private messages asking me to ask those questions. So I'm asking them.
Yeah.
We're going to go through them one by one. So global stuff like the UN or the EU or something that is transnational, can they do anything or do they not have power and competences?
I think it's a hard thing to look at. I think one thing is just looking at it and making sure they're actually capturing data for it and connecting it within the framework of transnational repression. I think that would then help guide any sort of policy position, because obviously once, say, for example, the European Commission or European Union starts really looking at this and looking at it as a framework through which they look at repression, they can then look at how they respond to it, whether from the annual rule of law reports, how this would get fed into that. So that would there be a reporting mechanism within the European Commission framework, so they actually know what they're looking for, because we do a lot of monitoring of the symptom, but not enough of the underlying tactic. So, there's been a lot of progress on Pegasus. There's a European Parliament inquiry. The US has blacklisted NSO Group, but that's just a symptom. You stamp out NSO Group, another company will come up. Before NSO Group, it was Hacking Team and Gamma Group. There's a huge market for privately sourced surveillance. So as soon as one company goes under, another company emerges to take that money. So you need to go beyond before that to look at the tactics used. So it's not necessarily the tool, it's the actual acts of repression itself. So I think there needs to be a lot more of a robust way of monitoring it, identifying it, and calling it out, using the sort of weight of diplomatic pressure that the EU, the UN, and also in the UN, we need to look at how the special rapporteurs interact with it. Because obviously this will cut across a lot of different rapporteur roles, the freedom of expression, right to assembly, human rights defenders. So it will cut across a lot of them. How can they coordinate to ensure that there is a shared response by the UN on this topic? And I think that I would say that this is something that does require targeted, specific attention. And the expertise is there. Obviously, there is a lot of expertise that looks at repression and the different markers and the tactics used, but how it intersects with technology, how it intersects with territoriality and sovereignty is something that I think they are really good. They need to really be better at responding with to. Nation states, I would say, again, this would split into two explicit categories: the states that the threat originates, and the states that host countries. Obviously, states where the threats originate need to be called out, and they need to be stronger adherence to rule of law and international human rights standards. This has not been done well. When Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered in Turkey, and most, including the US intelligence agencies, have sort of reported that they believe it was an order from MBS. There was a little bit of concerted international pressure against Saudi Arabia because of it, but that faded away very quickly. And now there's been no long-term damage. And even, the threats against Russian dissidents in the UK, there have been strong statements, some sanctions, some, attempts to deal with it, but nothing long-term. I mean, one of the people who's suspected of killing Litvinenko is in the Duma in Russia. So, there's been no real calling out to see that this is not a tactic that works. So Russia knows that the UK is a space where it can exert itself muscularly outside its borders. So more needs to be done to really call out and hold the states where the threats originate from to account.
Sorry, how do you hold them to account? Is it sanctions? Is it diplomatic pressure? How do you hold them to account in the first place?
I would say all of those things. It's all of those things. You know, it's diplomatic pressure. It's potentially sanctions. It's ensuring that they can't get access to these technologies. It's ensuring that this stuff can't be sold to them. It's ensuring that people who flee, that there are gateways to people who are being persecuted, and so they can reach safe third countries. There is a requirement for them to adhere to international human rights law. Of course, some states, you know, Eritrea, Iran, we've known the limits of international diplomacy.
Yeah.
But then actually with Iran, we have seen previously, before the Trump administration, at least that sort of dialogue.
Yeah, moving a bit.
Yeah, there was a little bit of movement. And then so ensuring that things like human rights standards are embedded in any of those conversations would be key. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be an easy fix. And because also it does overlap with sovereignty, and you know, Turkey is a perfect example. People that Turkey, journalists that Turkey has targeted in Sweden, for example, they've used Interpol red notices to get access to them because they will say that they've been convicted of a crime. The crime itself and the trial itself has been highly politicized. So states need to say no. It may have gone through your legal process, but there's been no independence, there's been no guarantors of the rule of law in that. So this is a political trial and Sweden has been very strong on that, to their credit. Social media, I think it's a hard thing, and it's getting harder and harder with the unpredictability of platforms such as X, formerly known as Twitter. And it's a very hard thing. I've spoken to, and in my article in Index, Ghanem Sasteri, the Saudi exile living in London. His social media accounts were taken down multiple times. He found it very hard to get them back up. His Facebook account was only brought back up after a journalist inquired. So it's very hard for him to make the case to the platforms. We know of dissidents having their accounts basically cloned. So there'll be a fake version of their Twitter account. And again, the processes by which they get them taken down are slow, cumbersome. And by the time they've taken down, frankly, the damage has already been done. Yeah. There seems to be very little proactive focus on this by the platforms to stop it being used to further accentuate that. And you've also had like gendered abuse of women who are living in exile. So Sheng Shui, a Tiananmen Square democracy movement sort of survivor, in Canada had sort of fake news about her shared to attendees of a conference she had organized. When she reported so much of this to the police, their response was, well, why don't you sue them? But she didn't know who they were. So how can you sue? How can you bring civil legal action against people you don't know who they are? And this is really hard. That's the really challenging thing, because you're sort of left almost alone, or you have to wait until an actual crime is committed before the state where you're based takes it seriously. And we've seen what happens when you wait that late. And I think, the key problem and the key thing that we need to work towards is attribution, is knowing how to attribute these sort of threats to states. And that's a very hard process. How do we know there's state backing behind a coordinated smear campaign? It may be a state, or it may be a well-organized private entity, or it could be totally organic. Not to say that's any better, but in terms of attribution, that does matter. The difference does matter. So how can we make sure that these tactics can be seen and identified and connected back? Pegasus NSO Group does not publish its client list. It also questions the validity of the paperwork upon which the Pegasus project's reporting has been based. So again, we don't even know which customers use that technology. So we need to get better at looking at how we attribute. And then also once we're happy with that decision, we adhere to that, and we make sure that country accounts for it. But as you said, there's such a complex interplay of different states working on this that it will require a real shift in how we look at repression. And also states need to look at this as a threat to their sovereignty, not just a threat to the individual dissident. This is a threat to your sovereignty. Like these authoritarian regimes are getting into your country to extend its repression into your country. That is a threat to sovereignty, and it needs to be treated as such. And I think that way, if we look at it, if we frame it that way, that could be a stronger impetus for states, host states, to do something. Because that's
so
what
let's talk about.
I mean,
yeah, let's talk about this, because I think what you all said made a lot of sense, right? We need sanctions, we need to monitor, we need to understand what the methodologies are, we need to be able to be less hypocritical in who we hold to account for it, and so on and so forth. But what should our country, so for those of us who live in democratic countries, for those of us who get to elect politicians on those agendas, for those of us that get to protest and make a mess when our politicians don't follow through, what should we be asking, right? Because we've seen this over and over again. You're based in the UK. We've seen in the UK, we held at Atlas, I think, 140 protests in support of freedom fighters across the world, including in the UK. And every single time, after the first few protests in London in front of the Chinese embassy, we had people fully dressed in black trying to intimidate us with their head covered. We had every Hong Konger having to come with masks and unidentifiable. We had issues with people being threatened before, during, and after, and so on, right? And we reported all of it every single time. They sent the military police to protect us. Every time we would report this, you would have big police people with guns, and we would say, look, this is happening. And nothing would be happening then. We've also had the same cases. We've had actually our social media accounts taken down as well after bot attacks from the Burmese pro-junta side when we're supporting the freedom struggles. What should governments be doing? Are there some that are doing better, and what are the best practices? Because again, I mentioned hotlines, for example, for individuals that are victims, right? To be able to speak to someone and get support. As you said, sometimes it's too late. Then the person it's already gone too far. So apart from this, what should our government be putting into place very concretely to protect people, and also, as you said, not be infiltrated like we've seen what allegedly seen in the UK Parliament with the parliamentary aid spying for China or something like this?
Yeah, I think there are some isolated examples. I'm not going to hold any country up on a pedestal, but I think there are some isolated examples that I think are worthy of attention. So Sweden's passed an amendment to their criminal code called refugee espionage, which looks explicitly the targeting of refugees in terms of intelligence gathering, but also how it manifests in more physical acts such as assault. And it's helped sort of at least identify it as something that then the police, intelligence services, and different states bodies need to look at, because obviously as soon as it's within the body of law, there's obligations on public sector bodies. And I know Finland has been looking at it. Finland have been the intelligence agencies in Finland have been strongly calling for a similar amendment to their bill. And I was told by the intelligence agencies in Finland that it is in the next program of government. So we may be seeing that in Finland as well. And that's a really good, just again, naming it, having it there is a really powerful symbol to dissidents that they know that they can go and, dream tonight, if it works well, they'll be taken seriously and the state resources will be put to it. But in terms of how you can respond to individual cases, I mean, Citizen Lab in Canada have been doing some very, very important work on the protection side for those in host countries. And they've talked exactly about what you're saying, Colombe, the idea of hotlines, the idea of resources for those who are targeted. They talk about that it being a multi-agency approach. So it's not being siloed into just the police or just the intelligence agency. Like support needs to come independent of those coercive arms of the state, but also feed into that as well, so that this intel can be shared. But when it comes to the protection of the dissident, that there is somewhere where they can get, whether it's psychological support, actual protections, whether it's physical or digital, but again, it's taken seriously that way, and greater coordination across the state as well. I mean, in the UK, they've just announced, last year they announced the Defending Democracy Task Force, which is chaired by the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat. And in it, it talks about it talks about transnational repression. And it's a really positive step. Again, it's naming it, it's putting resource to it, it's bringing together a forum by which elected officials, but as well as representatives of other parts, such as the police and the intelligence agencies, can respond to threats, but I mean, the worry I have is that very little has been made public. They may be working a lot behind the scenes, but there's not been anything made public. So we don't know as a country what's being done. There's been no public statement to say that this task force has done this or is doing this. So it doesn't really build the confidence in that way. So I would really implore the task force to start being a little bit louder with what it's doing, because we've seen Hong Kongers in the UK have arrest warrants out, and there's been there's rewards out for their arrests. They're based in the UK. Iran International had to flee its office because of legitimate threats against it from the Iranian state. Apparently, the Met Police worked very well on that, and there's been a lot of plaudits from Iran International to how the police responded. And apparently, they've moved back into another office in London. So that's a really good story. While they had to flee because of threats,
they could move back.
The threat environment has hopefully shifted enough for them to be safe enough to move back. So that's a really positive story. And I think, if they're from the sound of it, they were very grateful to the Met Police. So they seem to have worked very quickly and robustly. So that's a really positive step. So these sort of things, I think we need to know how to best respond to it, but also respond to it loudly so that those who are not targeted can still be sure that they can continue, because transnational repression doesn't only affect the person targeted, it's a chilling effect for others, because they'll be less willing to put themselves above the parapet if they see other people getting threatened for doing the same thing.
So I only had one question left for you that I received, but based on what you said, I'm going to put another one before that, if that's okay. So you mentioned the UK, right, that has the Met Police that responded well to this. I'm assuming, based on what I've heard as well, that in order to be able to report acts of transnational repression and to report that you've been subject to it, you need to have enough confidence in the authorities you're reporting it to and feel like you're going to be safe, right? And we've seen the UK government's policies on refugees and migrants get, well, it's my political opinion, but worse and worse and worse and catastrophic with time. And them threatening basically to send back, even though it's completely illegal, people that came illegally or have committed a crime or whatever. The list goes on. So how does this does this embolden in any way, or is it too recent to know? Home countries from where people fled, to continue to of extend their repressive arm, because they know that people are too scared in their host country to be able to say anything because of their asylum status or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any data on this, but my gut feeling is there will be a direct connection to it. Also, the same way as if you're worried about your status, if you're worried about the state's perception of migrants or asylum seekers or refugees, you're not, and also as a result of that, you also then it will erode your trust in other state institutions. Will you report threats to the police, or will you report threats to other mechanisms? I mean, I was talking about the Defending Democracy Task Force. There's no way into that task force, really. There's no hotline, there's no reporting mechanism. But so people would generally go to the police. The police would be their first port of call, because again, no one knows, how do you speak to MI5 or MI6 or GCHQ? No, you would go to the police. But if your trust in that institution has eroded, you will not go there. And I think broadly, yes. So I think, this is what, we are in a world custom made for transnational repression, in just how many people are having to flee. And also then there being not a political support for those fleeing. Some countries are better than others, but obviously there's no idyll, there's no utopia. There's these threats, and you're hearing more and more countries looking at the UK's Rwanda model as a model they may want to look at. I think I was reading about Austria potentially looking at a similar model. That will make it a lot harder, because the people being targeted are further isolated. States need to make sure that they are protecting refugees as much as they're protecting citizens, as much as they're protecting people who do not have refugee status. Like this is they will have. What transnational repression shows is that you need to do more than just get them outside of the border. Like the threats are ongoing, the threats continue. And so your obligation continues. You can't just get them into your country and then dust your hands off. That's not the way it will work. And I think having proactive protections in place, such as those represented by Citizen Lab, and their report on this is very, very good piece of work on this, sort of shows what your obligations look like moving forward as well. But I do believe that the broader atmosphere of anti-refugee, sort of xenophobic policymaking will be a gift for those who want to silence dissidents outside their state in countries like the UK, Canada, US, European countries. I think it will be a very difficult and dangerous moment we are in right now for this topic, to be honest. So yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. And I mean, to make it very concrete for people that are watching this, and this is some people at some of our protests have told me this over and over again. Just imagine having had to flee, you probably can't, your country of origin, then being subject to threats, being in an uncertain situation when it comes to your status in that country, and then trying to do something to support people back home or to just express yourself, and being worried that because you're doing this, on top of the threats you're receiving, you'll be sent back and risk life in prison or worse. That's what we're talking about, right? My last question for you is linked to education. So, and this is more linked to individual actions as well. What can we all do, right, to support? Because I think there's probably, from the people I've spoken to, there's something which is identifying that what you subject to is transnational repression in the first place, right? It's a term that is becoming more and more common in the activist community, in the international world, and so on and so forth. But again, I keep on mentioning Tibetans because I was actually with the Tibetan government in exile a couple of weeks ago to learn from what's happening. And they were telling me that one of the main issues is they don't identify themselves as transnational repression, as officials, and then also people in exile that might be journalists or just, anyone from the community receives a ton of threats, but doesn't recognize it as this because they haven't heard it, because they haven't been, I don't know, such a discussion around this and so on, which means that reporting it makes it very difficult because they don't understand or they don't know or they don't comprehend the fact that it might be way more systematic and that as a result, it might need to be addressed. So do you think that, for example, for people that will be watching this or for our team and so on, a part of the work that needs to happen is also more discussions within just journalistic circles, within activist circles, within everyday people circles about the tools used by repressive countries to control the narrative, about who might be a victim of it, about the fact that someone we might be speaking to might be subject to it, and that we could be supporting them in the first place. Is education something that you're looking at on this topic?
Definitely. I think being able to, for there to be spaces for human rights defenders, activists who are targeted, to be able to sort of communicate this out, saying this is happening to me. It also shares, you gain a lot of intel from others' experience as well, others in the same community. You may know there's something may have happened to them that's similar to something that happened to you, or something weird that happened to you has been happening to someone else. How people know about Pegasus, that their phone's has just been through others who have been targeted, being sort of flagging weird things happening with their phone or something, or there being a concern, and it's only through talking to others that they were connected to Citizen Lab or Amnesty or Access Now, who were able to then actually find out their phones were made vulnerable by the NSO group. So I think talking about this, so both in terms of the tactics used, the threats, but also trying to identify and pick together and sort of look at what these different tools used mean, and so people, you don't know what to look for if you don't know what you're looking for, sort of thing. And so by being able to learn from others, hear from others, just sort of being more aware of this, you're not going to overcome the attribution problem on your own. That's a bigger, harder conversation, but at least you can be aware of what are the threats that you're facing, and things like digital security steps that you have, maybe you can sort of share that to others as well. but just knowing what to look at, and then also through that, if you can build solidarity within these movements, you can also start building an evidence base that you can take to human rights commissions or NGOs or other groups to help build their evidence base as well, which will then in itself build awareness, and eventually you'll get states starting to take note. The US government is getting slowly better at doing this. The FBI have a page on transnational repression and even like a most wanted list of transnational targets. I think that's been a result of just years of civil society pushing and sort of trying to get this on the radar as a range of tactics and strategies that they should take seriously. So I think you can all do, obviously it's hard, and I would not recommend, the idea of like always assuming it's state-backed. That's going to be a hard thing to navigate around. But if you can just document what's happening to you, what's happening to others in your activist circle, just sort of being able and confident to be able to share this stuff securely, you may gain a picture that can help you know what's happening. And then that can inform advocacy and policy movements by others as well as yourself. But it's a hard thing, but we need to start talking about it. We need to name it. And we need to sort of see it as a key part of the global free expression space. And it's not going away. It's not going away. It will only bed down the more and more that we especially the more and more we depend on digital communication tools as well.
Thank you so much, Nik. I know I've kept you 19 minutes longer than we agreed. So thank you so much for making the time. I'll be sharing the recording and so on, and potentially as well the policy our team will be drafting on the topic if that's of interest. And for those of you in attendance, we'll continue the discussion right now with some of our team members sharing presentation, but I don't want to keep Nik further and longer than required. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone's time and their interest in the topic. And obviously, where I am, Colum, if there's any other questions or anything afterwards. So
we'll share it as well with people. We'll share your social media and so on.
Excellent. Thank you.
Much. And for everyone else who's here, Andrea Dorita prepared a presentation